Hello, everyone. It's Hooves of Doom again, and I'm bringing you another topic of the week. This is special characters in Warhammer. As usual, the initial video is done by Vince Venturella. This is a response. I will post Vince's video down below. You can check out that and any of the other responses to the video. So, do I like special characters? Yeah, I do. I think they've always been rather fun to use in the games. I really think they can add a lot of flavor to a collection and to an army. And some of the really iconic characters, Archaon, Tyrion, Malekith, really embody and represent their overall, their people and what they represent in the Warhammer world. And Archaon, for instance, is why I've always wanted to have a Chaos Undivided army, to duplicate the so-called Hordes of Chaos in much the same way as Abaddon does for the Black Legion in 40k. It makes that whole army come to life as his personal army. So did I use special characters in my games when I played? Sometimes, but not regularly. I know we've used Grimgor Ironhide, Teclis a couple times. Most of the time we didn't. In 40k, man, I remember playing, when I first got into 40k, I remember people using Eldrad for Eldar. But again, not unusual. We never had any rules against it or house rule against it. I just think we never really opted to use them that much. So, the other respondents to the videos that I've already watched have already covered this particular aspect to a tremendous extent. But the tournament scene was never that welcoming to special characters, which is why they're usually given. They're not given as much of a priority in many games, which is a little bit unusual given that most of their points costs in Warhammer were a little bit inflated for their utility. Who are my favorites special characters? Oh man, picking favorites among armies is really difficult for me. I will nominate Vardic Crom, though, as holding a special place in my heart. I've always liked his story, the fact that he's Archaon's a trusted leader and his personal herald. I like the model, and I like his special rules. But poor Crom never really got a whole lot of love or attention from the community. So, am I sad to see the role of special characters diminished in Age of Sigmar? Yes. But I want to explore my thoughts on this specific question a little bit more. I think it's, at this point, it's difficult to really know what GW is really doing. The seeming reduction of special characters is a loss, but I think that this is a somewhat more of a complicated issue than many people kind of would seem to indicate. Most of the bigger name characters, like those I've mentioned previously, like Archaon in the video, they still do have a presence of Age of Sigmar. So there are still special characters. And we can assume that the others will be getting something big and useful. I think in Age of Sigmar as well, and I think the economics of this is such that it's just not really viable to have a lot of small special characters that have a very specific look and have very specific rules. From the company perspective, I happen to own 2 Abaddons for 40k in my Chaos Space Marine collection, and it's just, why? I happened to pick one up as part of I think it was like a Craigslist lot or eBay or something. So I have 2, and they're there's no point in having that, so I'll probably be getting rid of one at some point. Whereas if I had like a generic Chaos Space Marine Lord, I would probably keep both. A lot of those kits have multi-purpose heads, different weapon options. You can have a variety of the same the same model in the army without much conflict, whereas special characters are kind of that's not the case with special characters. So with Age of Sigmar, the contention's really about the naming of characters, that they had a very unique Warscroll, but now in the newer books, they have a generic label, and they're less unique in the rules. Now, other people have already talked about what this means. I'm going to address it from the collector's standpoint, because that's what I know most about it. And it's probably a perspective that many of the other respondents won't address. I can talk about this a little bit more deeply, because that's kind of my interest in Warhammer to an extent. The Age of Sigmar books are certainly pushing named characters in the stories, but they are being represented by generic models. Now, that isn't that unusual, and there are some precedents for that type of behavior in Warhammer. For instance, if you look at old White Dwarf army lists, in White Dwarf Monthly, I guess, they always named, when they're listing out their armies, they're using generic models, but they always named each character and each unit. And I assume that is what GW has always been encouraging players to make stories and make characters for their own. And I'm going to touch on that later in the video. So the core of the issue has to do with Games Workshop's naming conventions, how they name models. And frankly, Games Workshop has been messing around with this for a very long time. As a collector, this drives me absolutely crazy. But it's because when you try to catalog a model or try to understand, okay, this model represents this, you would think it's fairly static, and that's absolutely not the case. GW doesn't consistently release a lot of catalogs anymore. I mean, the last one I know of was about 2010 or so. So I keep a database of GW models with saved images, dates, and their associated names on my computer. And the names in which they're associated with models change fairly frequently. For instance, you might buy a High Elf Archmage in 2003, but by 2010, it's listed in the Army book as simply a mage. Now, the name is a small difference, but it has a big difference in how the model is used in the game, its point values, and as a collector, it has a big difference to me as well. So this is so common that I would say it's probably an intentional thing. I mean, the only other way you can think of it is just whoever's making the Army book simply doesn't know the use of the model in the past, that they didn't know the history of the model range. Now, that's a possibility, but I think it's more likely that it is an effort to streamline the model line a bit. And in the case of Age of Sigmar, this type of effort is definitely on purpose, and it's definitely something that GW is intentionally doing. So I'm going to provide two specific examples of this occurring to special characters. And these are some of my two favorite special characters. One is Vardic Crom, as I've mentioned before. The other is Boargut Facebeater, which I absolutely love. This guy's so awesome. Both happen to be from Storm of Chaos. And Storm of Chaos was published in 2004. Both characters are specifically named in that book with special rules and fluff, and they have the picture associated with the model. By 2006, a couple of years later, Orcs and Goblins, poor old Boargut is no longer a special character. He's just an old generic black orc war boss with two chappas. And then in 2008, with Wars of Chaos, you can see Crom there. He's in the middle off to the left. He's no longer a special character either. He's just an old exalted... Oh, he's a champion of chaos, which is even lamer. Right? He's not even like a lord at that point. The other character on the left, in the middle as well, he's the other one of the other champions of chaos. He is also a named special character. He's called Harry the Hammerer. And again, like, I don't even know why they're putting those pictures in there if they're not representing what they... And Harry the Hammerer, I mean, he's not a common model. He came out with the anniversary of Games Workshop, or actually may have been the anniversary of Warhammer. But yeah, I mean, he's not a model that many people have. So the starter sets are interesting. So I've talked about how in White Dwarf they always named characters and even units. The starter sets in recent memory, like Island of Blood, the Battle for Skull Pass, and in 40k, a Dark of Vengeance, they all have named models, right? Most of us kind of overlook that, but they do. Those models are specifically named. The difference is that we just, largely ignore them. We own maybe a number of copies because most of us buy multiple copies of those starter boxes over the course of a number of years. And they don't have any unique special rules. In the Age of Sigmar starter box, the Lord on Dracoth, Vandus Hammerhand, is a named guy, as is the Lord of the Bloodbound faction in that box as well. But Vandus has a much larger role in Age of Sigmar than any other character from a starter box. He's in the Age of Sigmar novels and books. He's a pretty big presence. As I say that, though, I think there may have been like a novel associated with Island of Blood that maybe talked about those characters from that box set. But of course, I don't think anyone really cared. So this is a unique, different way of doing things. Maybe we will see a very specific model for Vandus sometime in the future, many years from now. In 40k, I don't really see any effort to eliminate special characters. And as Vince mentioned in the Grand Alliance book, there is an instance where a generic hero can be granted unique rules if they are included in a specific formation. That is cool. I would agree with him. We need more of that. The Warscrolls that were launched with Age of Sigmar, they represent every known current entry that had a specific model. So if you look at the back of the Warscrolls, there are some models that aren't mentioned in the Warscrolls, but they're generally fairly old. The scrolls which get a substitution, they all represent models that either had very outdated rules or never had a specific dedicated model. So you can get an Archaon on foot from a Games Day. It was like 2000 Games Day or something. But there were never actually specific rules in an army book for that model. There may have been one in White Dwarf at some point. But that's where a lot of those Warscrolls or why those Warscrolls are not really represented in the generic Warscroll list that we got when Age of Sigmar launched. Many of the lesser characters that we knew from the world that was were killed off in the end times. And so it's more about trying to understand why the new Stormcast and the new Slayer models, why they don't have characters. Or at least the characters that we're used to seeing as a specific kit. There is some reason to believe that the role of special characters will be diminished, but I'm very hesitant to say that they will be gone forever. So, to go back to the question for this portion of what's my opinion on Age of Sigmar characters and what are my emotions about it, am I sad? I do think it's a shame that special characters might have a limited role. Because of all the editions of Warhammer, This is the one where they can never be too overpowered. You have Archaon, the exalted champion of Chaos Undivided, Lord of the End Times, the so-called Three-Eyed King, the World Raiser, the thirsting predator himself, and he can get completely hosed by a bunch of skeletons. So the same concerns in tournament play just don't exist. I think the economic concerns, as I mentioned earlier, are still practical. I think the characters we're going to see for Age of Sigmar are bigger, expensive kits that are designed to have a very prominent place on the battlefield. We've seen Archaon, we've seen Nagash. That's what I'm expecting for a lot of these factions when they come out with a major character. That said, Vandus Hammerhand is a major character for the Stormcast Eternals, and he just gets the old model out of the starter. So I'm going to end on 3 thoughts. I do think characters will exist, but probably not on the same scale in terms of how many will exist. That said, they might surprise us and start coming out with a few more at some point in the future. As I argued in a previous video, about a week or so ago, historical characters, the ones that we have Warscrolls for, they will always remain valid, provided you have the scroll and your opponent, isn't a complete douche and he's willing to allow you to play the way you want. This is a game, Age of Sigmar. This is a game that strips the conventional restrictions of wargaming, and it really encourages players to play the game any way they want with whatever models they want. So I would even make a note from what GW has done historically and name your characters. Perhaps convert them so that they make, they're a little bit more unique on the battlefield. And frankly, this is, somewhat contentious, of course, but there's nothing that prevents you from even making your own war scrolls or a specific mission or a battle plan in which your character has a unique flavor. It just depends on what your opponent's willing to do, but there's no point values in the basic game. You could come up with some sort of comp for it if you want, but it just depends on coming up with something that's fairly reasonable. Lots of scenarios have unique command abilities. You could definitely add something like that onto an existing scroll with your opponent's permission, of course. But I mean, it's really easy to make that individualistic leap in this game. So those are my thoughts on special characters in Age of Sigmar or in Warhammer, and appreciate you guys listening in. Have a good one.